U.S. President Donald Trump's tariffs have forced Canada to re-evaluate interprovincial trade barriers hours after President Donald Trump signed executive orders implementing tariffs on goods from Canada. Although Canada sends nearly all its crude oil to the United States and has little leverage because the U.S. is the destination for most Canadian exports, the country slammed the move and promised retaliatory measures. But could Canada really stop oil flow to the U.S. in response to Trump tariffs? And what measures are there to put in place? Join us as we reveal Canada to replace U.S. with China for oil exports. Will Trump impose tariffs on Canada again? A potentially catastrophic trade war between the United States and Canada was narrowly averted when the U.S. President Donald Trump made a last-minute decision to delay the imposition of a contentious 25% tariff for 30 days. While that only temporarily relieved tensions between the two neighboring nations, it actually brought about a strong backlash within Canada. A growing number of Canadians are speaking out in anger, with some even calling for a national boycott of U.S.-made products. Others have gone further and said Canada should cut off its crucial oil exports to the United States as a means of punishing what they feel is an unfair trading policy. However, such a drastic step would come with enormous economic risks for Canada, as the country is strongly dependent on the U.S. as a major oil export market, and nearly all its crude oil is transported via a vast network of pipelines that crisscross U.S. territory. Those pipelines, on which the Canadian oil industry rests so heavily, would be significantly impacted by any effort to stem the flow of crude oil southward. While cutting off oil exports to the U.S. could be a potent bargaining chip, it would also stop the flow of oil to refineries in Canada's eastern provinces, further compounding the headache. The prospect of Canada diversifying its export markets presents its own set of challenges. Canada has enjoyed close trade relations with the U.S. for decades, bolstered by the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. That agreement, renegotiated by President Trump in his first term from 2017 through 2021, has been the mainstay of economic integration between these two nations for decades. Because of that agreement, Canada's economy is closely aligned with the U.S. economy, and a reorientation of oil marketing by Canada to other markets without monumental dislocation of the Canadian economy would take much time and effort. However, a tit-for-tat tariff announcement from the Canadian government has sent prices soaring for consumers both in the United States and abroad, affecting the costs of items such as food, electronics, and cars. What was this response? Anyway, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has detailed retaliatory measures in response to the United States' decision to impose a 25% tariff on Canadian exports. At a Saturday night news conference, Mr. Trudeau revealed that Canada would impose a reciprocal 25% tariff on 155 billion Canadian dollars worth of U.S. goods, approximately 106 billion U.S. dollars. His proposal would respond to new tariffs the U.S. will begin collecting on Canadian goods, while offering a countermeasure to what Trudeau calls an illegal move by the Trump administration. The effect for now will hit Tuesday, the same day the U.S. imposes its tariffs, when Canada will impose tariffs on 30 billion U.S. dollars in American goods. The balance of the tariffs will be implemented over the course of the next 3 weeks to give Canadian businesses and supply chains some time to adjust and seek alternative suppliers. Trudeau went on to elaborate on the range of the tariffs, which he said would be broad-based, including everyday items that would affect American consumers directly. Included are American beer, wine, and bourbon, fruits, fruit juices like orange juice, vegetables, perfume, clothing, and shoes. Also targeted are household items such as appliances and furniture, as well as sporting goods and materials, including lumber and plastics, meaning the tariffs would affect both consumers and industries in numerous sectors. At the news conference, Trudeau cast the tariffs as a needed move to defend Canada's economic interests, but also dwelled on the long-standing bonds between the U.S. and Canada. He made an emotional appeal to President Trump, saying that if the U.S. really wants to enter a new golden age, it should look to partner with Canada, not punish it. Trudeau wasn't just speaking to American leadership, he was also speaking directly to the American public about the consequences of the tariffs being felt by ordinary Americans. He then called on Canadians to rally behind their economy by patronizing Canadian-made products at the expense of U.S. ones, going so far as to recommend that Canadians adjust their summer vacation plans to stay within the country's borders as a show of solidarity. While the White House has not responded to Trudeau's announcement, news of it reverberated on the broader international stage. Although using oil exports as leverage may be an option for Canada, the complexities of the economy make it dangerous to use, and the Canadians may find themselves forcing the U.S. back to the negotiating table on tariffs isn't worth potentially harming their industries and workers as well. But how will crude oil shipment suspension work against Canada, resulting in more general damage beyond merely trade negotiations? Canada's pipeline infrastructure is uniquely structured, and its design presents significant challenges when considering any potential disruptions to oil flows between Canada and the United States. The main issue lies in the geography of the pipeline network, which has been built with both Canadian and U.S. refineries in mind. That system starts with vast oil-rich areas in Western Canada, including the Western Canada Sedimentary Basin, which encompasses all of British Columbia and Alberta, most of Saskatchewan, and half of Manitoba. Most of the country's crude oil is pumped out of this region, which is home to both conventional and oil sand operations. The crux of the problem lies in the route the oil must take to reach Canada's eastern provinces, including Ontario and Quebec, where much of the crude is refined. Instead of a simple pipeline system contained entirely within Canada, much of the crude oil is transported through pipelines that pass through U.S. territory. Those same pipelines serve Canadian refineries and those in the United States. Much of that infrastructure dates back to the 1950s, a reflection of decades of cross-border energy integration between the two countries. The interconnection system developed over time has meant that a large portion of Canada's crude flows through U.S. territory before reaching its final market in eastern Canada. Canada and the U.S. made a deliberate decision to integrate their energy infrastructure, said Guitane de Silva, former CEO of the Canada Energy Regulator, CER. The choice to intertwine the two energy systems was made to increase economic efficiency and strengthen trade. It's been that way for a really long time, she added, underlining how deep this cross-border energy cooperation runs. The signing of NAFTA in 1994 included a very crucial provision: the facilitation of energy trade among the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. It dropped most of the tariffs and laid the foundation for continued cooperation in energy. The 1994 NAFTA deal was very favorable to the U.S., which wanted to gain as much access as possible to Canadian energy supplies. De Silva said there was a large appetite within the U.S. at the time for Canada to export as much energy as possible. That trend was only further solidified when the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, replaced NAFTA in 2020 under President Trump. While it did bring in some changes, the USMCA retained most of the provisions under NAFTA, including energy export provisions that ensured the flow of energy resources across the Canada-US border would not be significantly affected. Geography also plays an important role in the design of Canada's pipeline network. However, it is complicated by the geology and the region's geography. As De Silva explained, building pipelines across Canada's vast continental shield, an area made up of ancient, hard Precambrian rock, poses serious challenges. This shield covers nearly half of Canada's landmass, making it difficult to route pipelines through certain regions. At the same time, this part of the country is further complicated by the presence of the Great Lakes, which pose natural barriers to pipeline construction and add even more logistical complexity to the creation of a comprehensive pipeline system. The U.S. also benefits from Canada's flows of oil. While some Canadian crude is sent to refineries on the U.S. East Coast, much of it is also directed to the U.S. Midwest, where a large concentration of refineries lies. Interestingly, some of the U.S. refineries are geographically closer to Canadian oil sites than the refineries in eastern Canada. For instance, the oil-producing region of British Columbia is closer to California than it is to Ontario, meaning that the oil from that region travels more efficiently to the U.S. refineries than to the ones in Canada. Over time, this cross-border energy distribution system has become deeply ingrained in both nations' economies, and any disruption to this flow would have far-reaching consequences on both sides of the border. This highly integrated and complex energy infrastructure points out the difficulties Canada would face if it attempted a drastic move, such as halting oil exports to the U.S. The pipelines not only serve Canadian refineries' needs, but also play a critical role in meeting the energy demands of the U.S. So any unilateral change to this system is a complex and costly decision. Still, there is hope that this decades-long cooperation between the U.S. and Canada in the energy sector will reflect a mutual dependence, or maybe not. Anyway, what is making today's tensions over tariffs all the more significant for Canada? In addition, data from the Canada Energy Regulator, CER, also shows that in 2023, nearly 97% of Canada's crude oil exports went to the U.S. That lopsided dependence on a single market flags an abiding challenge for Canada. Despite being among the world's top oil producers, infrastructure constraints and historical trading patterns often have held it back in diversifying its export destinations. The reliance is not one-sided. Canada is the biggest supplier of crude oil to the United States, accounting for 60% of total U.S. oil imports in 2022, says the U.S. Energy Information Administration. All this has deeply interlocked the energy sectors of the two nations, underlying how important stable trade policies and adequate infrastructure are in underpinning the cross-border flow of crude oil and refined products. The Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers said Canada's total oil production in 2024 reached 5.7 million barrels per day. Of that output, some 4.3 million barrels per day were exported to the U.S., roughly 75% of the total. That underlines the fact that the American market continues to be such a critical backbone for Canada's oil sector, even with recent moves toward more exportation to other international markets. What are these recent moves? Let's see. Since the expansion of Canada's Trans Mountain Pipeline was completed in May 2024, a tangible change has taken place in the country's energy export landscape. On nearly a daily basis, a tanker carrying Canadian oil sands crude oil passes under Vancouver's iconic Lions Gate Bridge to foreign markets across the Pacific. These tankers, bound for refineries in countries like China and Japan, mark a major juncture for the Canadian oil industry. For decades, Canada's vast oil production has depended almost entirely on the American market, which has long been the country's largest and most convenient client. The shift to diversifying export markets comes at a time when there has been increasing volatility and uncertainty in the U.S.-Canada trade relationship, most recently because of President Donald Trump's threats to slap tariffs on Canadian goods. That success has helped to drive the 34 billion Canadian dollars Trans Mountain expansion, which effectively doubles the pipeline's capacity. The pipeline now provides the means to ship oil sands crude from Alberta's oil fields to the West Coast. where it can be loaded onto tankers and sent to global markets. That opens the door for Canada to tap into the vast Asian market and lessen its long historic over-reliance on U.S. demand for its oil. Though the United States has been a trusted trading partner for many years, the political and economic instability in this relationship has raised questions about how dependent Canada should be on its southern neighbor. The risk of tariffs, especially the 25% tariff that Trump had requested, was just the start of this risk. Adam Waterous, a former investment banker and founder of oil producer Strathcona Resources Limited, said the Trans Mountain expansion is critical for Canada. "It's a good start," he said, reflecting the cautious optimism many in the Canadian oil industry felt. But Waterous also underlined there is a lot more to be done if Canada is to harness its full potential as a global energy player. "We must now build upon it," referring to further construction in the sphere of infrastructure, market development, and strategic diversification. Fortunately, Canada does not have to start from scratch in this effort. The country's oil sands industry already represents one of the world's biggest, and once the Trans Mountain expansion is finished, the base is laid for increased exports to Asia and other foreign markets. The expansion would also give Canada the capacity to ensure its crude oil reaches new customers without the choke point of a single market, potentially insulating the country from political and economic turmoil in the U.S. The strategic importance of the Trans Mountain expansion aside, the Canadian oil industry increasingly sees the need to lessen reliance on a single market. With the dynamic global energy situation, and as countries like China and Japan look to diversify their sources of crude oil, Canada is repositioning itself to play a greater part in world oil markets. That is especially important now as Canada balances the challenge of responsibly dealing with its natural resources with the opportunity to assert itself as a reliable, stable supplier in a world where energy security is ever more crucial. Although environmentalists point to climate change and the risk of spills, many Indigenous groups have fought projects on the grounds of land and treaty rights, holding up approvals in courts. Approval for pipelines has also been caught up in political battles between federal and provincial governments, including provinces such as British Columbia and Quebec, that have opposed routes through their territories. A number of large projects, including Keystone XL, Northern Gateway, and Energy East, were scrapped due to such pressures. Yet, the 2024 completion of the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion is one of the few recent success stories. But as Waterous pointed out, the journey doesn't stop when the Trans Mountain expansion is complete. The Canadian government will require continued investment in new infrastructure, the building of international partnerships, and adaptability to the dynamic changes in the global marketplace's energy source needs. Still, how much of Canada's oil industry remains heavily reliant on U.S. exports to the detriment of market diversification and bargaining power? Although the Canadian federal government technically has the authority to halt oil exports to the United States, exercising that power would be fraught with legal and political complexities. Canada is a confederation in which power is divided between the federal government and the provinces. Most crucially, oil production is under the jurisdiction of provinces themselves. Hence, any attempt by the federal government to intervene in oil exports would surely meet at least some legal challenges and resistance from the provincial governments. There are definitely legal questions there because Canada's never done it before, said Gaetano da Silva, former CEO of the Canada Energy Regulator, in an interview with Al Jazeera. The unilateral attempt to shut off the taps could provoke a domestic constitutional crisis, since that would represent a frontal challenge to provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan, which are highly dependent on oil revenues and have long resisted federal intrusion on how they do things. Besides the legal obstacles, blocking oil exports to the U.S. would present serious logistical challenges to Canada itself. The country's eastern provinces, Ontario, Quebec, and New Brunswick rely on oil piped through U.S. territory. If Canada ever were to cease exporting crude, there's a very real chance that the U.S. might retaliate by curtailing the supply of oil bound for eastern Canada. That would leave those provinces vulnerable, at the risk of fuel shortages and price rises. One of the essential elements in all this is the 1977 U.S.-Canada Transit Pipelines Agreement. Under this pact, it becomes quite clear that neither country should undertake actions in order to impede, divert, redirect, or interfere with in any way the transmission of hydrocarbons in transit. The signing of the treaty was basically made to ensure ease in the flow of both oil and natural gas across both borders. Theoretically, if Canada tried to shut off oil exports, the U.S. could bring the action to court under this treaty. De Silva stated that legal mechanisms alone may not be sufficient in dealing with a crisis like that, considering even the unpredictability of the Trump administration's approach to international agreements. With the Trump administration, I don't know if they are that focused on those international treaties, she said, worrying aloud that the United States might not hew to traditional diplomatic and legal norms in response to such a crisis. Finally, while halting oil exports might be a perceived lever in Canada's trade battle with the U.S., the risks and consequences of doing so could be extremely dire, both legally and economically. It would bring about divisions within Canada, disruptions in energy flow to crucial provinces, and a very uncertain response from the U.S. government. Given all the foregoing, this is an enormously high-risk, uncertain strategy. Moreover, the response to tariffs points to heightened tensions and possibly a broader trade war. This would be a historic chance for Canada to redefine its role in the global oil market, meaning that more infrastructure projects and market agreements will be needed to diversify Canada's oil exports and strengthen trade relations with other energy-thirsty countries around the world. Thanks for watching. Remember to like and subscribe to Politics for more updates. While you're still here, make sure to click the video on your screen for more mind-blowing videos.